hit a button that records us. And here we are back again in Old Testament Survey. This is session number 17, if you can believe that. We've been going at this for 17 minutes. I don't know, what have we been at it, a month now in the Old Testament? We're almost into Exodus. that's terrible. At this rate, we'll never get done. But fortunately for all of you, I will speed this up just a bit. We are in the book of Exodus, and we will begin at chapter 19 as Moses shifts from the story of the Exodus itself into the description of the receiving of the law. I'm going to use the whiteboard to give you some structural things that are going on here that are maybe going to be helpful for understanding how to understand the law in the Old Testament. The giving of the law takes place, of course, here in Exodus, but we see the development, the expression of Old Testament law all the way through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. There are a grand total of, I believe, 640 statutes of Old Testament law. And some have misunderstood these. Some have deliberately misunderstood them. The Jewish people have misunderstood to some extent the purposes of the law. So I'm going to spend a bit of time thinking through what the law in the Old Testament is really all about. And to get there, we're going to use some whiteboard. All right, and I'm sharing my whiteboard. And make some stuff go away here. When we think of the Exodus itself and the relationship to the law on Mount Sinai, there's a motif in ancient Near Eastern literature of the various other nations surrounding Israel that is a good parallel to the pattern of Exodus and then the giving of the law. It's what we call the conquest stroke house building pattern or motif. Conquest leading to house building. When a god like Baal was when his story was told, the story follows a pattern of the god conquering another evil god. In Baal's case, it's the god Mot, death. And every year, Baal would return and bring the rains, and he would be said to conquer Mot, death. And so this is his conquest. And the next section of the mythology of Baal was that he would have a house built for himself, a temple. So the conquest is his defeat of the bad guys. The house building is the building of a temple where he could be properly served. In Israel, what we have happening is a similar pattern. The Exodus is a deliverance from slavery, and it's often illustrated in the Old Testament with the conquest of a monster, the conquest of chaos. And from this deliverance from slavery in Egypt, the people of Israel were led out into the wilderness where the law was given. The law was meant to provide a structure within which the people of Israel could freely serve God. Now, when we think about this structure, which is the law, I think it's important to remember that the structure is not the salvation. The structure is a place for saved people to live out their free lives. So they've been delivered from slavery to Egypt, like you and I have been delivered from slavery to sin. The movement out of bondage, and here we'll put bondage on this side, the movement out of bondage is marked by the crossing of the Red Sea. Okay, and then that place, we're told over in 1 Corinthians 11 that all these Israelites were baptized into Moses. They went into the sea and under the cloud and were baptized into Moses. That is, they were identified with Moses as the people of God. They went into the Red Sea as an act of faith, an act of obedience to the words of God, because they had already been redeemed. We learn that from the book of Romans. That's the pattern is clear. Our obedience to God is one of the first symptoms of the work of God's Spirit in our midst. And so we've got a people of God who've been delivered from slavery and are now identified with Moses as a single people of God. And the outcome of that is that God says, I'm going to give you a structure now for living the life that I have called you to live. The law is intended not as a means of salvation. Salvation happened as a result of the grace of God, the power of God over Egypt. Salvation is an act of God. The law is meant as a blessing for saved people. And I'm going to write that here someplace, a blessing for saved people. Okay, at Sinai, this house that is built for Israel is not a temple, but rather a law that gives structure, dimension, and purpose to life. The law was never meant as a means of salvation. And anyone who tries to teach you that has made a major misunderstanding of the Old Testament. Salvation has always been, as it was for Abraham, a matter of the grace of God, responded to by faith. Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him as righteousness. There's justification by faith. So we are never, ever justified by the works of the law. That's so clear in the New Testament, but I believe that New Testament truth is built solidly on this teaching of the Old Testament. Okay, we're going to kill that, clear the drawing, and I'm going to draw you another picture, because as we get into the Old Testament law, we see this huge body of laws, 640, okay, 640 odd plus or minus statutes, various laws. And those are divided up not quite right down the middle, but they're divided up into ritual law, which has to do with Sabbath rules, kosher rules, the rules of the sacrifices, the rules of the priests, the rules relating to the holy things around the tabernacle. There's a wide variety of laws, and they have to do with worship and with the believer's relationship to God. The approach to God is by means of sacrifice and holiness. The the rest of the laws that we find in these books, really quite the majority, roughly 500, are what we call civil law. Civil law includes criminal law, but it also includes what modern scholars call tort law. So if I were to do something to hurt you, you could sue me, take me before a judge who would say, Dr. McMath owes you this much money for the damage that he's done to you. Okay, that's a lawsuit, that is what we call tort. There are some civil laws that are not really criminal. They're more misdemeanor type laws. If a man does this, that, or the other thing, you shall bring him before he shall pay a fine of such and such. Okay, those are all civil laws, and the civil law has to do with the relationship of man to man. So ritual law has to do with man to God. Civil law has to do with our relationship to one another, man to man, man to woman. So lots of things are in here. Financial laws, things like the year of Jubilee and the Sabbath year, sabbatical year, the laws about marriage and family, relationships, various kinds of sexual improprieties, things you can do and can't do. All of that is at this point. Financial things, contracts, damages, lots and lots of little laws. Now, in other parts of the ancient Near East, there were also law codes. And one of the most famous ones is the law code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi, I know that's easy for me to say. Don't worry about the spelling or any of the rest. I probably spelled it wrong. I think there's two M's, but I can never remember. Hammurabi was a king of Mesopotamia who probably lived around 1800 BC. So before Moses, after Abraham. And Hammurabi was not the first king to produce a code of laws, but his laws are probably the most famous. He put these laws on a great big stone stele. There were probably more than one of those, but we've found one, and that stele is now in the I can't remember if it's in the Louvre or in the British Museum. It may be in the Louvre. A great big limestone stele carved with the cuneiform laws of the Babylonians. And what is fascinating about the laws of Hammurabi is there's about 470 of them, and they mostly have to do with civil law. But Hammurabi is all case law. If something happens, then you as the judge, then the result, if a man does such and such, then you shall cut off his arm, or fine him 300 euros, or take away his slave, or whatever the rule might be. Case law is produced by judges. Individual judges would sit and decide things, and the decision would be written down, and everybody would remember that. What Hammurabi did was to, and actually it's probably not Hammurabi himself, but his assistants collected as much case law as they could find. And they collected this all, put it all on one big stele, and that had the advantage of giving some order to Mesopotamian society. So law, even Hammurabi's law, is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. And it helps to keep society somewhat more orderly, because people know what the rules are, or at least they have some idea what the rules are likely to be. The difference between Hammurabi and Old Testament law, see if I can erase some of this. Hammurabi is case law. Let me show you, oops, the difference here. Old Testament law, all the 640 statutes, is built on 10 commandments. The 10 commandments include 4 that are ritual and 6 that are civil. And the 10 commandments express positive value in the form of universal principles. So you can take the 170 or so ritual laws of the Old Testament, look after each one of those, and you can relate them back to one or another of the first 4 commandments. You can take all of the civil laws of the Old Testament and relate them back to one of the 6 civil commandments. So here we have 10 commandments that express universal principles. Now, an important question that we really have to ask before we launch into a look at the 10 commandments themselves, a really important question is, where do those 10 commandments come from? Some have argued that the 10 commandments express a universal law that is above God. So the universal law is out there, and God just can't change it. He is bound by the law. Others would say that God is completely unbound. He can do anything he wants, and the law is arbitrary. Okay, so if you happen to be Muslim, you would believe that God is utterly unbound by any universal law. He can do anything he wants. And it is impossible to predict what God will do about anything. And a thing that is right today may be wrong tomorrow, and you can never know for sure. This is why a Muslim will say, Inshallah, if Allah wills it. You can never predict anything. This is why the Muslim world has tended not to excel in science and engineering. Those are things that depend on fixed universal physical laws. And of course, if you believe in physical law, you're contradicting Muslim scripture. Well, what do we do with this? Is God bound by some universal law? Yes and no. The universal law that we're speaking of is actually a reflection of the character of God himself. So I'm going to draw another layer here, and I'm going to make it bigger. It's larger and older than the Ten Commandments. And we're going to call this, it can be called a number of things. Typically, it is called natural law, but it should be called universal law. And this universal law is bound up with the character of God himself. God is at the core of it. God exists, and his attributes and personality are reflected in the natural law. So 2 plus 2 always equals 4. Doesn't matter what language you say it in. That's always true, and we really can't change that. Water turns into steam at 100 degrees centigrade, and that's just the way it is. And we can understand that natural law, we can use that natural law, but we really can't violate it. It is just the way it is. People who violate the law of gravity usually do so to their own destruction. So there are natural laws in the sense of various physics laws, mathematical laws, biological laws. If you happen to notice that your female cat is spending a lot of time with the boy cat down the street, the result of that may be a litter of kittens for you. Now, why is that? Well, because God made living things male and female, and that's the way it works. In our modern world, there are people who are telling us that there aren't two genders. There are actually, I've forgotten what Facebook has these days, 67 different ways of doing it. That's a stupid idea. That's a technical word for something a scholar thinks is just plain dumb. But that's a stupid idea. Anyone who examines the natural world will know that boys and girls are different, and we are obviously created that way. And life goes on. Now, in addition to the physical laws, there is also moral law. Moral law or spiritual law. Some things are good and others are evil, not because God has arbitrarily said so, but because they could not be any other way. So murder is always wrong. Murder defined as the unlawful taking of human life. It is always wrong in every circumstance to unlawfully take human life. It is always wrong to steal. If I see something I want and it doesn't belong to me, it is wrong for me to take it. It is always wrong in every circumstance, no matter how hungry I am, no matter how badly I need a new watch, it doesn't matter. Stealing is always wrong. And again, this is not a religious thing, it is universal. There are universal moral laws. And this idea has been understood by philosophers going all the way back to the foundations of Western civilization. So you'll hear of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, who argued against another group of philosophers called what were those guys called? The Sophists. The Sophists. They called themselves Sophists because they thought they were so wise. And the Sophists believed that nothing necessarily needed to make sense. Nothing needed to be absolutely true. It was Socrates who first argued that the Sophists are crazy because even in their arguments, they are agreeing that some things are universally true. If you make the statement, it is absolutely true that nothing is absolutely true, you're making an absolute truth claim. And it turns out that your truth claim is false. It's a crazy thing. So sophistry was defeated by the ancient philosophers who essentially said, with Plato, there are universal ideas that are absolutely true in the eternal sense and cannot be any other way. And it's our job to discover what those are. Aristotle had a different way of figuring it out. The Stoics began speaking of that universal set of rational truth as the logos. And you've probably heard that word before. In the New Testament, the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, and that's the Greek word logos. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Stoics used to say this natural law is a universal spiritual reality that exists eternally in the mind and in the character of the God character himself. And the Stoics didn't really have a handle on who God was. It's not until the Middle Ages that Christian philosophers put all of this together. And we call this, the whole theory here is natural law theory. Here's where I'm going. God, in all of eternity, has always known the truth about physical laws and about moral law. Spiritual law has always been true. It didn't suddenly become true. The 10 Commandments are a summary, what we might think of as the cheat notes for natural law. If you want to know the basic outlines of how the world ought to operate in accordance with the reality of the logos, which underlies all of existence. The logos is the creator, and the law exists everywhere that he exists. If you want to know what is going on there, look at the 10 Commandments. And then for the specific details of how to live out these 10 Commandments, you look at the 640 statutes. The 640 statutes exist as again, a shorthand of how cases ought to be determined for Israel living in the land 3,500 years ago. Modern legal systems still ought to be built on the 10 Commandments and in turn on universal law. The laws themselves will be different. And so the individual, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk, for instance, makes very little sense to us today. None of us are tempted to do that. But there are other laws that really ought to be in place to guide us today. That's how the law works. So I'm going to stop that. Let's see if I can make this happen. Oop, no, come on. All right. I'm going to quit that, and we're going to begin sharing the. Here we get into the Ten Commandments themselves. Okay, we'll start out with Cecil B. DeMille. This is a movie that was made a long time ago. The Ten Commandments, and there's Charlton Heston as Moses, getting ready to knock down the Ten Commandments. It's an interesting picture with the Red Sea sloshing around in the background. It's a great picture. Chapter 19 of Exodus really introduces us to the whole legal structure of the Old Testament. And we're not going to spend a huge amount of time on this. We really aren't. We're going to basically go through the Ten Commandments and the tabernacle today. Then we can understand some of these basic things. As we get into the law, I've spoken of the word law, and I haven't used the word Torah. Torah. There's a Hebrew word which we usually translate law. That's not a very good translation. It's the best we've got, but it's not a very good translation. I would say, and this is what I have in the notes, Torah is the spirit of right, which reflects the character of God himself. So the Old Testament word for natural or universal or created law could be thought of as Torah. Torah. In the New Testament, I think it best to call that same law Logos, the word. So deep within the character of God himself exists this spirit of right, this absolute standard of right. Later on, that becomes very important because of the doctrine of salvation. What we are lacking when we sin is not conformity to some specific rule, but rather a lack of conformity to the infinite, absolute, perfect holiness of the character of God expressed in Torah. So it's a very high bar, and something that Paul ultimately decides we cannot clear. We cannot be holy except by the grace of God. For Israel, at Mount Sinai and in the wilderness, the law reveals the basic principles of God's will for them in their specific culture and historical situation. It constitutes a covenant or contract between Israel and Yahweh. Obedience to the covenant did not determine salvation, but rather blessing. To what extent do you want to enjoy your time in the land? To what extent do you want to continue to live in the land and not be driven out of the land? Your obedience to Torah will determine that. And then thirdly, the law was designed as guidance for saved people. It was never a means of salvation. It was always designed as a blessing for saved people. The unsaved do not interact well with the law. We in America hear a lot of disdain, a lot of anger directed toward the Ten Commandments, particularly, but toward the Christian concept of universal law. Many modern people would like the law to be utterly changeable and evolving to meet whatever their modern desires might want to be. And God never intended that to be true. There are some things that are unchanging and universal, and there can be no blessing. In other words, life will never be happy apart from obedience to the universal law. For future generations, the law constitutes the basic foundation of God's moral universe. This is natural law. This is a supernatural and universal set of absolutes that can be discovered by a careful study of the created order. Nature itself teaches you. So when we look into places like Isaiah, the ox knows his master, the donkey knows his owner's stable, and yet you, my people, don't know. What is your problem? You can't even learn from nature. From the beginning, have you not known? Have you not observed? Has it not been taught to you? The creation set of basic principles of how things really are and where the blessing lies is obvious to every human being. This we often sometimes call general revelation. It's really a very big concept. So then secondly, for future generations, the law demonstrates the elementary principles of all true religion. And trying to do something outside of biblical law will never get you to a place of blessing. So let's see the covenant proposal. This begins in chapter 19. Israel is at Mount Sinai, and on the third new moon, this is 19:1. There's St. Catherine's Monastery in the background. This is a very desolate place. Neither of the mountains that you see there is the traditional Mount Sinai. It's actually the one off to my left. And the Lord called to Moses on the mountain in verse 3, saying, "Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. You shall be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." These are the words you shall speak to the people of the nation of Israel. Okay, that's a fascinating thing. Here's what the law is for. If you will obey my voice, I brought you out. Now I'm giving you this law. You shall be a treasured possession to me among all of the peoples on the earth. So the privilege of being a treasured possession. More than that, you shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Very significantly, Peter quotes this passage in his first epistle in the New Testament. Peter says that we as a church are a holy nation and a kingdom of priests as we wait for the coming of Christ. We are in many ways the fulfillment of this promise to Israel. And then God goes into the description of the Ten Commandments themselves. There's Charlton Heston as Moses, and the Ten Commandments are found in chapter 20 of Exodus. Beginning at verse 1, God spoke all these words, saying, beginning at verse 2, "I am the Lord your God, Yahweh your Elohim, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." This commandment prohibits placing anything, or anyone for that matter, that is less than God in God's place in our lives. Nothing short of God himself, the God of reality, can have God's place in our lives. And any other obedience, any other allegiance in our lives needs to be secondary to our allegiance to God. This is not the prohibition on idols that we find in the second commandment. This says that God is the supreme being. You must worship nothing else as supreme, whether that might be prosperity or money or sex or drugs or alcohol or even good things, a favorite hobby, a favorite person, a favorite movie, whatever. None of these can be as important as God himself. The second commandment, you shall not make for yourself a carved image. The worship of created things or the images of created things that become substitutes for God is always wrong because, again, of creation. I'll say this just once and let it be a general principle for all of the Ten Commandments. All of the Ten Commandments have their basis in the creation reality. So you shall have no other God. Why? Because God is the creator. He is above the creation. You must not worship a created thing, whatever it might be. Nothing, no idea, no person can be equal to the God who created. Secondly, idols. God created man to be the image of God. Any other image of God is blasphemy. We are making God into something that he cannot be. God is not that statue. He is not that thing that we worship over there in the corner. Idolatry is placing in God's position in our life some substitute, some physical substitute. The third commandment says, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. The Hebrew is b'sheva. Sheva is vanity or emptiness or like a vapor. You shall not treat the name of God as though it were meaningless. Now, obviously, people do that when they use the name of God as a swear word. When people speak of Jesus or of God the Father, and call down some blasphemy, they don't expect it to really happen. They don't expect that to happen. They don't believe that there really is a God. They're using God's name as though that means nothing. So it is a trivializing of God. When we think of eternal damnation and hell, for example, that is such a desperately serious idea that we must never use that flippantly. That's not a swear word. That's a horrible destination for everyone who rejects Christ. A terrible, terrible thing. So how is not good. The name of Jesus should never be used in swearing, obviously. But even more than that, sometimes we Christians have a way of praying as though what we were saying had no serious significance, and we tack in Jesus' name, Amen, at the end of our prayers, not expecting God to interact with our prayer life. When we pray, God is actively involved, and that's a good thing. Okay. No vain use of the name of the Lord. Fourth, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter or your male servant or female servant or your livestock or your sojourners within your gates. For in 6 days God made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy. Okay, this is a long commandment. There's a lot going on in this fourth commandment. The one thing that this doesn't say is that believers must worship on the seventh day. It says we're to take a rest on the seventh day. The basic image of Sabbath, Shabbat, is that of a rest. And the object lesson in Jewish tradition is that from Friday sundown until Saturday sundown, no work is to be done. And this has become a very great burden. Visitors to Israel will notice some very unhappy people. These are the Orthodox Jews complaining about all of the rest of us who go out and live our normal lives on Saturday. Most of us don't believe that that the Sabbath law requires sitting and being miserable all day Saturday. The Sabbath rules for Israel were unique, and they involve there's a lot to the Sabbath law, but it's meant to be an object lesson of something larger. The Sabbath rest is a picture for us of the believer's rest of faith in the completed work of God. So God provides the manna for 6 days. And on the seventh day, the people can rest from gathering manna because God has provided. That's an act of faith. It's actually a very good thing. And we ought to trust God enough to work 6 days and rest for one. And so the Sabbath law is not meant to be yet another religious obligation. It's not meant to be a curse. Over in the New Testament, Jesus rather deliberately tweaked the Pharisees with his healings on the Sabbath and the disciples grinding grain on the Sabbath and those things. He waited for the Pharisees to be close by before he would do those things, just so he could tell them, the Sabbath is made for man, as a blessing implied, not man for the Sabbath. Okay, so the Sabbath law is given. Then we go on to the laws which are specifically civil. And you'll notice there are 3 of these laws that specifically have to do with the family. Honor your parents, honor your father and your mother, in order that your days may be long in the land and that the Lord your God is going to give you. So the first of the civil laws, the first and most important of the civil laws, has to do with family. Children, and specifically here this is adult children, honor your parents. Give them a place of honor in your lives. Give them access to the grandchildren. Visit them on their birthdays and anniversaries and whatnot. Honor your parents. That's a good thing. And the pattern of generations is to be one of respect and care and mutual support. The family, in the biblical sense, is the core of society. We can see in societies all over the world the result of broken families. When people choose not to keep their families intact, when they choose to do dishonoring things with one another and to their parents, to the children, Families that grow up without fathers are heartbreaking. We have a terrible problem in this country, in America, of families where children grow up without fathers. Uh, and they abuse drugs more. They're divorced more often. They spend more time in prison. They commit more crimes because they have no father in life, and the father's often doing other things or in prison or whatever. And this is a terrible thing. The family is the core of society. We ought to go out of our ways to strengthen families. And to encourage families, and to build families, and to spend time with, anyway, honor your parents. And we do that as individuals in a myriad of little ways. When my father-in-law was still alive, I used to show him my respect by asking for his advice. He loved to give me advice. And sometimes I would do exactly what he suggested, and other times I couldn't, but I would always ask his advice, and I would listen carefully because he had lived longer than I had, and he knew more than I did. No matter how much I knew, he always knew more. Okay. We take care of our parents as they age, and at the end of life. We care for them even when they can no longer recognize us. The generations need one another, and we need to care for one another. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not commit murder. The sixth commandment is the prohibition of the unlawful taking of human life. Okay, careful definitions there. It does not say thou shalt not kill. Which would involve killing vegetables or ants that are getting into your kitchen or all of these other things. That's not what the commandment says. It says you shall not commit murder, the unlawful taking of human life. God has already commanded that the manslayer, the man or woman who murders another person, is to be put to death by the civil authority. So capital punishment has already been laid down as a universal rule. God is not violating his own rule here. Murder is the unlawful taking of human life. And the positive creation set idea is the fact that life is a gift of God. Human life is sacred. All life is sacred, actually. Animal life is sacred, and we're not to kill an animal for food without thanking God for that animal. That's a big part of it. Okay, you shall not commit murder. This is foundational and is universally true. The seventh commandment, you shall not commit adultery. Adultery is a word that has a modern specific definition, but the Old Testament word is a much larger concept. If we were going to take time to go all the way through the Levitical laws and the rest of the Exodus laws having to do with the sexual relationship, we find that there is one relationship in which the sexual function is blessed. That's the marriage of man and woman. When the parents give their children to one another as husband and wife in the marriage contract, that relationship is sacred, a trust before God that must never be violated. Now, it's possible to violate that sacred trust in a huge variety of ways. The Bible lists all sorts of things that can be considered adultery in the broad sense. So homosexuality, for example, bestiality, incest, sex with children, sex with I'm not going to try to list them all because people keep making up new ways of being perverted. And each of these perversions is objectively wrong and universally wrong, and not just religiously wrong, but universally wrong, and will always be cursed. There can never be a good outcome to these things. You shall not commit adultery. Men who decide that they want to be women so that they can compete in a track meet are objectively violating this law. Okay, the eighth commandment, you shall not steal. To steal is to take a thing that doesn't belong to you. This law is the foundation of the idea of private property. If something belongs to me because I purchased it or I've built it myself, then it's mine and nobody else has the right to take that from me without compensation. I have a cup of coffee here. If I'd like to sell that to you for 50 cents, that's my right. And if you think 50 cents is too much to spend for a cup of coffee, you don't have to give me your 50 cents and I don't have to give you my coffee. That's the basis of a whole set of transactional things that we call capitalism, the exchange of property for a price. And there's nothing wrong with that. If I decide to sell something, you decide to buy something, and we agree freely with one another, that's capitalism. And that is all that capitalism is. It is the agreement that we will not steal from one another. Whether I put a gun to your head and take it, or I'm the government and I come in and take things away without compensation, it's always wrong. Number 9, you shall not bear false witness, or more specifically, you shall not lie. This commandment specifically looks at the courtroom, but in every position, the truth is important to God. Men ought to seek out and always tell the truth. That's very important for our relationship to one another. It's very important for our relationship to God, because in God, all of the truth exists forever. And then finally, you shall not covet. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Coveting is a fascinating thing because it's the beginning of jealousy, is the beginning of all sorts of improper desires. If I see my neighbor's house and he's got this great, big, beautiful house, and I wish I could have that house, eventually I might come to the place of thinking that I deserve that house. I have a right to that house, and I should, by force, go over there and occupy that house and drive my neighbor out of his house. Well, that was wrong. What's the opposite of coveting? I should be happy with what God has provided me. The Lord will provide, and He always provides everything that we need. We need to learn to be content with what we have. Now, if we see something that we don't have that we'd really like to have, it's like, oh, that, look at that new, 2-cylinder motorcycle. Wow, what a nice motorcycle. That would get me to work a whole lot quicker. If I put aside 10 euros every payday, eventually I'll have enough to buy the motorcycle. Well, maybe it'll take a while, but you get the idea. There's nothing wrong with setting a goal for something that's important and of value, but to covet it to the point of wishing you could steal it, or wishing you could murder the owner and grab it, that's wrong. Coveting tends to lead to other sin. Okay, so from here, those are the 10 commandments, and the 10 commandments lay out the basic foundations of everything else. In chapters 21 through 24, we have a variety of laws. There's a bunch of little laws here. about idols and altars. The idols can't be anywhere close to God's altar. The altar had to be of field stones, ordinary rocks and stuff. Have I got anything about idols and stones and altars? Probably. Yeah, I'm not going to show you that. There's laws about Hebrew servants. Later on, we're going to see the introduction of the sabbatical year. The servant must be set free after 6 years. You've got 6 years of service. That's what you paid for. You weren't paying. You don't own the person. In Hebrew society, servitude was not perennial. It wasn't forever. In other societies, a person could purchase a man as a slave. Now, there was slavery within Israel, but the slave was selling his work, and only for a limited amount of time. In the sabbatical year, the servant is set free. And the servant could choose to continue working for his master, but he was free to do that. That's a major distinction. Laws concerning personal injury, protection of property, property rights, various kinds of social relationships. Chapter 22 is a list of all kinds of, wow, you wouldn't believe the rules in chapter 22 are rather amazing. Various kinds of sexual things, sorcery when related to sexuality, bestiality, all kinds of things are prohibited. If you can think of something really, really evil to do, there's probably a law here to tell you don't do that. Civil behavior in chapter 23, rules about the Sabbath in chapter 23. 3 annual festivals are listed in chapter 23. These are the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which includes Passover and happens in April. The Feast of Harvest, which happens in late May, this is Pentecost, and the Feast of the Ingathering, which is Tabernacles in October. Now, there are some other festivals that go with this, but all of these are basic. These are the annual festivals, along with Yom Kippur, which we'll see just a little later. The preparation for the inheritance in chapter 23, and then we see the covenant confirmed, chapter 24. That takes us up to the tabernacle. The tabernacle, this isn't the tabernacle in the background, that's the Western Wall in Jerusalem. The point of the tabernacle is as symbolism. The tabernacle was a tent that symbolized a way of approach to God. It was a visible demonstration of God's presence in the midst of his people. As a type or symbol, the tabernacle illustrates Christ himself as man's only approach to God. The pieces of the furniture are all symbolic. And so the design is given here of the enclosure, the tent itself, the division of the tent into a holy place and a holy of holies, the various pieces of furniture, the table of showbread, the menorah or lampstand, an altar of incense, and then inside the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, a box into which the tablets of the law would be placed. The design for the tabernacle is given to us in chapters 25 through 27. The consecration of the priests is given in chapters 28 and 29. In 30 and 31, the worship in the tabernacle is described. A couple of builders are appointed. The Sabbath is described even more. And then the tables of stone, the tablets of stone, are given to Moses, the end of chapter 31. In chapter 32 through 34, where we see the failure of the people. This is the episode of the golden calf. Aaron was convinced by the people that he ought to make a golden calf for them. They built a fire, and Aaron took all of their gold jewelry and threw it into the fire. And he says, and out came this calf. Moses was so angry, he took the 10 Commandments and broke them. In chapters 35 through 40, we see the description of the tabernacle itself. Now, this is a picture that helps us to understand this. Let me see if I can make my thing into a big pointer, a laser pointer. Okay, here's my laser point. See that? The outside screen, kind of a fence, what we call the courtyard of the tabernacle, is entered way down here in the bottom, about where the con of construction is. There's a gateway or a pylon into the holy area, into the sacred space. Once inside the sacred area, we find an altar for burnt offering. That's this box here, which in the wilderness was not made of stone, but was made of bronze, a big bronze grate that was carried around. Just beyond the altar of burnt offering was a thing called the laver. The laver was a big bronze bowl for water, and the priests could wash there. The people of Israel would bring their sacrifice up to the gate to the tabernacle. The priest would take it from there. The sacrifice was done on the altar. The washing of the priest was done here at the laver. Both of these are symbolic. There is no worship apart from the shedding of blood. Every man's hands are dirty in the presence of God and must be washed. The tabernacle itself is a tent of 5 by 15 cubits. It's a relatively small tent divided into two areas, the holy place and the Holy of Holies. A veil, a piece of goat hair and other stuff, very carefully decorated, divides between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. Inside the holy place, a table of showbread, where a bowl of manna is kept. And later on, bread would be made every day to represent the fact that God provides bread for his people. The lampstand in the tabernacle is a reminder that God is light. In him is no darkness at all. Jesus said, I am the light of the world. The incense altar is a reminder that entrance into the presence of God is by means of prayer. The incense in the ancient world was always a symbol of prayer. The Ark of the Covenant was a box. The word ark means a box. The mercy seat is a rather bad translation of a Hebrew word that means literally a lid for the box. Now, it was a very ornate lid. It was made of gold or gold overlay. And there were a pair of angels, cherubs, on either side of this lid. And between the wings of the cherubs, here above the Ark of the Covenant, the Shekinah glory of God, a bright light, would show. So the only light in the Holy of Holies was the light of God himself. It was a very bright place. Interestingly, ancient Near Eastern temples all had roughly this same shape. The big difference is that ancient Near Eastern temples, like the temples in Egypt or the temples in Greece, would start out with lots and lots of light and would get progressively darker as you got into the Holy of Holies, the most holy place where the idol lived. And that place was lit by some candles. And the priests would perpetually try to keep some candles going in there. There were no candles. There was no lampstand in the Holy of Holies. God was the light within the Holy of Holies. And when you walked into the temple, you weren't walking into the darkness. You were walking into a brighter and brighter light. And the symbolism there is very, very important. Okay, this is the book of Exodus. Book of Exodus is all about God's grace reaching down to redeem a people for himself. God reached down and took these people out so that he could bring them in to the promised land. That was the point of the whole exercise. As we walk further into the Pentateuch, as we get into Leviticus, and I hope Numbers on Wednesday, we're going to see more of this preparation for putting a people together who can go into the promised land, be there, the people of God in that promised land. God has done the same thing with us in that he has brought us out of sin. He's delivered us from slavery to sin. We are no longer in bondage, but rather we belong to God. We serve him in a newness of spirit and of heart because God has changed us. And he has brought us out of that in order that we might be brought into a life of blessing with him in a holy place where we live for him. This is overall a good thing. This is overall something that we can praise God for and bless God for. This little book of Exodus is a picture of our salvation. We'll continue on Wednesday. We'll probably do Leviticus and Numbers on Wednesday. That's what I'm hoping for. Then we'll do Deuteronomy on Friday and be done with the Pentateuch. Maybe. I hardly ever manage to keep up with myself. so we'll keep looking. God bless everybody. I'm going to, Donna has gone off with Deborah. So I have to say bye-bye to everybody.
Bye-bye, Dr. Jan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Jan.
Thank you, Eddie. Thank you. The Seed family, I'd like you guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Jan.
Hey, Joel, I'll see you. Bye-bye, Oscar. Let us stay in touch. I'm going to keep looking at flights on the airplane. We need to get you out of there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jan. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Love you guys.
Buonasera a tutti. God bless
Bye-bye.
you all.
Buonanotte. Good night all.